The emergence of Yahweh and the development of monotheism. Introduction. The origins of Yahweh, the central deity of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have been the subject of scholarly inquiry for over a century. This report examines the prevailing academic consensus regarding Yahweh's emergence from a Canaanite religious context and the subsequent development of monotheism. Abraham, known as Ibrahim in Islamic tradition, was born in Ur of the Chaldees, generally identified with southern Mesopotamia in modern-day southern Iraq. The area is what historians later called Babylonia. Abraham's origins are debated, with evidence suggesting either an Amorite or a Canaanite background. The Amorite hypothesis places Abraham in Haran, within the Amorite homeland, reflecting the migration of Amorite groups into the southern Levant during the 2nd millennium BCE. The lifestyle of the patriarchs in Genesis resembles that of Amorite pastoralists, and the name Abram itself appears in Middle Bronze Age Amorite contexts. Alternatively, the Canaanite hypothesis situates Abraham within local Levantin traditions. Inscriptions from the Negev and references to nearby tribes suggest that the name Abraham could derive from local ancestors, and the earliest traditions emphasize land, offspring, and altars in Hebron rather than a Mesopotamian origin. Overall, the biblical portrayal of Abraham reflects either an Amorite migrant background or a local Canaanite ancestral tradition. Historically, the city of Ur was a major center of Sumerian civilization in southern Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, among the earliest urban societies, flourished from roughly 4,500 to 1900 BCE and practiced a rich polytheistic religion, worshipping gods such as An, Enlil, Inanna, and Nomna, the moon god particularly associated with Ur, Abraham's traditional timeframe, in the early 2nd millennium BCE, places him in the later period of Sumerian cultural influence, overlapping with the rise of the Akkadians and Amorites in Mesopotamia. Consequently, Abraham would have grown up in a deeply polytheistic Sumerian environment, which helps explain why biblical and Quranic narratives emphasize his rejection of idolatry and his turn toward monotheism. The Sumerian religion was a pagan, primarily polytheistic system encompassing a vast pantheon of gods, associated with natural forces, celestial bodies, and aspects of daily life. Among these deities, solar worship held a prominent place, with the sun god serving as a central figure of justice, law, and cosmic order. Serpent symbolism also appeared in Sumerian myth, often connected to fertility, protection, and the underworld. The religion included temples, rituals, and offerings devoted to these gods, reflecting the Sumerians' complex cosmology and their integration of natural and symbolic elements into spiritual practices, characteristic of ancient paganism. According to the Bible, Genesis 11:28-31, Abraham traveled from Ur to Haran. The city of Haran, located within present-day Şanlıurfa, Turkey, appears in the Bible as Abraham's temporary home during his journey from Ur of the Chaldees to Canaan. According to the Hebrew Bible, Terah, Abraham's father, settled in Haran with Abraham, then Abram, his grandson Lot, and Abram's wife Sarah, then Sarai, as part of their planned migration. Some interpreters, such as Maimonides, suggest that Abraham may have been born in Haran and only later moved to Ur before returning to Haran en route to Canaan. Abraham lived in Haran until he was 75 years old, after which he continued to Canaan in obedience to God's command. Later biblical references list Haran among cities subjugated by Assyrian rulers and among trading partners of the Phoenician city of Tyre, indicating its historical significance in the region. Haran's population in Abraham's time, in the early 2nd millennium BCE, was heavily influenced by Mesopotamian culture, but was not strictly Sumerian. By this period, the Sumerian civilization had mostly declined, giving way to Akkadian, Amorite, and Babylonian influences. Haran was an important religious and trading center, particularly devoted to the moon god Sin, reflecting the broader Mesopotamian polytheistic tradition rather than specifically Sumerian practices. While Haran shared cultural and religious roots with Sumer, its inhabitants at the time were likely Amorite or Akkadian speakers. Continuing the Mesopotamian religious traditions, the Quran describes Abraham as originating from a people who worshipped idols, highlighting his rejection of polytheism, though it does not specify his exact birthplace. Historically, southern Mesopotamia is considered his point of origin before his migration toward Canaan, in the region of modern Israel, Palestine, and the broader Levant. Yahweh's origins in the Canaanite context. Scholars generally agree that Yahweh originated within the broader Canaanite religious milieu. Evidence suggests that Yahweh was initially worshipped as a regional or tribal deity worshipped by the Shasu nomads, a group of semi-nomadic peoples in the southern Levant, including areas such as Edom and Midian. Egyptian texts from the 14th and 13th centuries BCE reference the land of the Shasu of 𝗍𝗶𝗁𝗲, indicating the presence of Yahweh worship in these regions prior to its adoption by the Israelites. The Canaanite pantheon, headed by El, included various deities such as Baal and Asherah. Yahweh may have been a local manifestation of El or a distinct deity within this pantheon, a child of El. Over time, Yahweh absorbed characteristics from other Canaanite gods, a process known as syncretism. For instance, epithets like 𝗖𝗆𝗲𝗶𝗁𝗲 were applied to Yahweh, reflecting this assimilation. Abraham's role in the evolution of Yahweh worship. The biblical narrative presents Abraham as a patriarch who worshipped Yahweh. While the historical accuracy of Abraham's existence is debated, his portrayal in religious texts indicates a shift towards exclusive worship of Yahweh. This move from polytheism to monolatry marks a significant development in the religious history of the Israelites. Monolatry is a religious practice of worshipping one god, without denying the existence of other gods. It differs from monotheism, which asserts that only one god exists, and from polytheism, which involves the worship of many gods. In a historical context, early Israelite religion is often described as monolatrous, as the Israelites worshipped Yahweh exclusively, while acknowledging that other gods existed for other peoples. Monolatry can be seen as a transitional stage between polytheism and full monotheism, and Abraham's devotion to Yahweh represents an early example of this practice, emphasizing exclusive worship of one God in a polytheistic world. Abraham's commitment to Yahweh, as depicted in religious traditions, suggests a departure from the polytheistic practices prevalent in his time. This emphasis on monolatry laid the groundwork for the later evolution towards monotheism. The transition from monolatry to monotheism. The transition from monolatry to monotheism in ancient Israel was gradual and complex. Initially, the worship of Yahweh was exclusive, but the acknowledgement of other deities persisted. Over time, particularly during the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, prophetic movements and reforms led by figures such as King Josiah sought to eliminate the worship of other gods, culminating in the belief that Yahweh was the only God in existence. This shift is evident in texts like the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15, which, while acknowledging other gods rhetorically, ultimately asserts the supremacy of Yahweh. Israelite and Judahite kings and the influence of Baal worship. Several Israelite and Judahite kings are recorded in the Hebrew Bible as having worshipped the Baals or promoted Baal worship, often influenced by Canaanite religion or political alliances. Ahab of Israel, 9th century BCE, is perhaps the most infamous, marrying the Phoenician princess Jezebel, who actively promoted the worship of Baal and Asherah, and building a temple and altar to Baal in Samaria. King Solomon, 10th century BCE, despite his wisdom, is also said to have turned to idolatry in his later years under the influence of his many foreign wives. building high places and altars for Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and other gods, including Baal. In Judah, kings such as Ahaz, 8th century BCE, introduced Canaanite-style altars and engaged in Baal worship, while Manasseh, 7th century BCE, reintroduced idolatry, setting up Asherah poles and altars to Baal and practicing divination. Many other kings tolerated Baal worship to varying degrees. These practices often coincided with political marriages, alliances with Phoenicia, or attempts to integrate local Canaanite religious traditions. The link between Abraham and later Israelite kings, such as Ahab, Solomon, Ahaz, and Manasseh lies in the contrast between Abraham's exclusive devotion to Yahweh and the later king's engagement with Baal worship and other Canaanite deities. Abraham, as depicted in the Bible and Quran, rejected the polytheistic religions of his time, establishing early monolatry centered on Yahweh. Centuries later, kings like Solomon were influenced by foreign wives and political alliances, building altars to foreign gods, while Ahab actively promoted Baal worship under the influence of Jezebel. Ahaz and Manasseh in Judah similarly incorporated Canaanite religious practices, including Baal worship, into their reigns. This contrast highlights a recurring biblical theme: the tension between the monotheistic covenant of Abraham and the recurring lapses into polytheism among Israelite and Judahite rulers. In ancient Israel, there were periods of religious syncretism, in which monotheism and polytheism overlapped, and Yahweh and Baal were sometimes intertwined in practice and imagery. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that Israelites occasionally blended Yahweh worship with Canaanite deities, particularly Baal and Asherah, with inscriptions and high places suggesting that Yahweh and a consort goddess were worshipped together, or that Baal-like imagery appeared in Yahweh's cult. Yahweh and Baal shared attributes such as storm, fertility, and warrior aspects, facilitating the merging of their roles. The Hebrew Bible condemns Molech worship, which involved child sacrifice, and some scholars argue that elite Israelites participated in similar practices under Canaanite influence, as suggested by archaeological findings like Tophets in Phoenicia and Judah. Abraham and the sacrifice of his son. The Bible reflects a transitional movement in Israelite religion from its Canaanite roots, where child sacrifice was practiced, to a later monotheistic identity that sought to distance Yahweh from such rites. The firstborn principle, found in Exodus 20-29 and 13:2, shows that Yahweh originally demanded the firstborn of both man and beast, a command that paralleled Canaanite traditions of dedicating children through sacrifice. Exodus 20-29, "You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me." This verse places human firstborns alongside agricultural and animal offerings, making clear that they originally belonged to Yahweh. Exodus 13:2, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the Israelites, of human beings and animals, is mine." Here Yahweh directly claims ownership over every firstborn, both human and animal. Taken literally, this matches Canaanite practice, where firstborn children were sacrificed. Over time, however, Numbers 18:15-17 introduces the concept of redeeming firstborn sons with substitute offerings, signaling a shift away from literal child sacrifice toward symbolic devotion. Ezekiel 20:25-26 offers a haunting reflection on this history, suggesting Yahweh once gave them statutes that were not good, so they would defile themselves by sacrificing their firstborn, a theological acknowledgement of Israel's entanglement with such practices. The binding of Isaac in Genesis 22 embodies this tension, with Yahweh commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son, only to halt the act and replace it with a ram, thereby setting a precedent for animal substitution. Taken together, these texts show that sacrifice was central to Yahweh worship, that early Israelite religion shared in the child sacrifice practices of its Canaanite environment, but that later prophets deliberately reframed Yahweh as a god who rejected such acts, shifting the emphasis from blood sacrifice to obedience, justice, and mercy. Thus, what began as a literal demand for the lives of the firstborn evolved into a system of redemption and ultimately into a rejection of child sacrifice altogether. In Christian theology, the firstborn principle is reinterpreted through Jesus, who is called the firstborn among many brothers, Romans 8:29, and the firstborn of all creation, Colossians 1:15, where the Hebrew Bible demanded the consecration of the firstborn, sometimes through literal sacrifice, later through substitution and redemption. Christian thought presents Jesus as the ultimate fulfillment of that demand. Just as firstborn sons in Israel were redeemed with the blood of a substitute animal, Numbers 18:15-17, Jesus is portrayed as the final substitute, the one whose own blood redeems not only Israel's firstborn, but all humanity, Hebrews 9:12-14. The near sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22 is reframed as a foreshadowing. Abraham's son is spared, but God's own firstborn son is not, providing the ultimate offering. In this way, Christianity takes the biblical trajectory from early child sacrifice to animal substitution to prophetic rejection of human blood, and resolves it in Christ, who embodies the firstborn principle as both the consecrated child and the redeeming sacrifice. Passages like Ezekiel 20:25-26 acknowledge that child sacrifice was once part of Israelite practice. Over time, the tradition moved from literal child sacrifice to redemption with animal substitutes to prophetic denunciations of human sacrifice altogether. When Christianity reframes Jesus as the firstborn Son of God who is sacrificed, it is symbolically reworking that older pattern. Jesus becomes the final and ultimate child sacrifice, but in a theological sense, he is willingly given by God. In this way, Christianity absorbs the deep, primal archetype of firstborn sacrifice from Canaanite and early Israelite religion, but transforms it into a cosmic, once-for-all event that abolishes the need for further sacrifices. The earliest layers of the Bible reflect that child sacrifice was expected, but later Israelite religion reinterpreted it. From a modern psychological perspective, Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son to Yahweh, traditionally identified as Isaac, whom Jewish traditions suggest was a young boy between 8 and 12 years old, can be seen as an extreme manifestation of devotional fanaticism and absolute obedience to authority. The act of preparing to burn one's own child raises profound ethical and moral concerns, which contemporary psychology might classify as pathologically rigid or fanatical behavior, even though within the religious narrative it is framed as an expression of faith and piety. The story also reflects the lingering influence of Canaanite religious norms, where child sacrifice to deities such as Baal and the storm god El was historically practiced. Early Yahweh worship may have incorporated some of these ritualistic elements, including the offering of a firstborn or beloved child. The narrative further underscores the psychological trauma inflicted on Isaac, forced to carry the wood for his own potential sacrifice, a deeply disturbing detail that compels the child to participate physically in the act of his possible death, while Abraham's deception, telling him that God would provide the lamb, introduces an additional layer of moral manipulation and coercion. Viewed through a psychological lens, the story exposes the dark extremes of unquestioned obedience, the internalization of divine command, and the ethical blindness that can accompany absolute religious devotion, highlighting the tension between faith and the innate human aversion to harming one's own offspring. Conclusion: the emergence of Yahweh and the development of monotheism in ancient Israel reflect a complex interplay between historical, cultural, and religious influences. Yahweh originated within the broader Canaanite religious milieu, likely as a regional or tribal deity associated with groups, such as the Shasu, and may have initially been conceptualized as a child or manifestation of El. Abraham's devotion to Yahweh marked a pivotal shift toward exclusive worship, establishing early monolatry that set the foundation for later monotheism. Over time, Israelite and Judahite kings, influenced by political alliances, foreign marriages, and Canaanite religious traditions, often engaged in bull worship and other forms of syncretism, sometimes including practices like child sacrifice. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that Yahweh and Baal were at times intertwined in ritual and imagery, highlighting the fluidity of religious practice. Ultimately, the historical evolution from Abraham's monolatry to the full monotheism of later Israelite religion illustrates both the enduring influence of Canaanite polytheism and the transformative role of prophetic, reformist, and cultural forces in shaping the exclusive worship of Yahweh.